We're still Sound Roll 312-10 and Camera Roll 312-20. Next is Mr. Goeppinger in Boone, Iowa. Take one.
Okay. So I'm going to start by asking you just to talk about what the business of a rural bank was like. I mean,
Rural bank.
A rural bank.
Oh, rural
exactly.
bank, yes,
Yeah,
yes. You don't want any of my biography, you don't want any of that, do you?
No, I'm not worried about that.
Okay.
Just sort of,
Yes, yes.
especially, sort of during this time we were talking about.
Sure.
I have to put this temporarily.
Yeah.
So what was a rural bank like the one your dad was running doing in the 1920s in a community like this? What was their business?
Well, the rural bank was strictly a cooperative venture between the shareholders and the depositors and the borrowers. They each needed each other. And the depositors furnished some money for the bank to operate on so they could lend out, and the so-called capitalists, that was a bad word in those days, but as it is now, they furnished the capital to organize the bank and provide the necessary reserves to organize the bank. So the three needed each other.
Was there a lot of expansion going on in the 20s? Were people buying a lot of land, buying up a lot of land, taking out mortgages and stuff?
Yes, the 20s were very expansionist. That was one of the reasons for the eventual crash in 1929. That's what started that, because people had a better idea of value than income warranted.
What a person would come into the bank planning to buy 100 acres, buy what? I mean,
well, a young man would come in. His father had died or had retired, and he wanted to buy the family farm, and he needed capital to operate and didn't have much savings. So he came to the bank for capital to borrow, to buy some land to start off. Typically 40, 80 acres at that time, and he gradually expanded, where 160 acres was a normal-sized farm. And then as they got more prosperous, thought they were more prosperous, which was not the case. Prosperity was false. They needed more money, and that's what gradually got the banks and everyone into difficulty.
So what exactly happened can you describe to me the way in which economic trouble kind of developed in Boone? What were the first signs, and how did it affect the whole? You used an expression. You talked about a kind of domino effect. What did you mean by that?
Well, the expansionist philosophy started to prevail. The banks were lending money on values rather than the income that was produced, thinking that if land was overpriced, it was not producing the income that it should for the overpriced piece of people were paying for land, and they lent money on that basis. And when it turned out the income would not warrant paying that much money for land, then they began to run into trouble. The loans were not being repaid on time, and they were slow. And some people ran afoul of the law and ran into bankruptcy and other forced repossessions, and that caused the dominoes started to fall.
So what was this domino effect? Can you kind of paint a whole picture for me from the prices fell and then?
Sure. Prices started to fall. The crash was in 1929, and that began the banks across the United States started to fail in large numbers, about 30 and 31. And gradually reached agriculture late 31 and early 32, where prices were inflated, and all of a sudden when the stock market banged, that also dropped and caused asset values to depreciate. And if you borrowed an X amount of dollars on a farm and the farm was not worth that much when the loan was due, you couldn't pay. So that's what started the domino effect. And depositors soon heard of that, and they thought, hey, if that's the case, maybe I better start getting my money out. And they started the run on the bank.
So was there a lot of fear and anxiety? Your dad was president of this bank, right?
Yes.
What was the sort of emotional climate around here? What did it feel like? Were you aware of people being sort of nervous and anxious?
At that time, I was 19, 20, going on 21 years old, so I'm beginning to be aware of some of those things. The facts of life were becoming aware to me, both physical as well as financial. And people wanted their money, and the banks were not always able to provide the money to pay off. They were having trouble. So they started a waiver where people would sign a voluntary piece of paper that they would not withdraw their deposits. And of course, by asking for that, that began to say, hey, if I can't get my money, there must be something wrong. And that's what started, the dominoes started falling faster.
Were you, did you feel or did you sense that people were kind of angry at the banks? Was there tension in the kind of relationships that?
There was a terrific amount of anguish and trauma on three sides. One from the bankers themselves, who could not meet the demands of the depositors, and these people were all friends and acquaintances. There was anguish on the part of depositors who could not get their money out, and there was anguish on the part of farmers, especially, who were beginning to lose their farm because of not being able to pay. And it was just a telescoping of one anguish into another. Pretty soon it became a calamity. And that's what started this waiver that I referred to. You may not want to get into that now, I don't know. But
Well, I was going to lead up to it a
Sure.
little bit later. Did your dad ever have to, or did you have personal experience watching someone actually get their farm foreclosed on?
Oh, yes, many times, yes. And it was a terrible anguish where you had to get a hold of the sheriff and go through a legal process to get the farm back. It was much quicker than it is now. The law has been changed now where the borrower has more rights and, in effect, has more time to redeem his loan than they did then. But it could be, I think it was 6 months you had to ask for your money. If you didn't get it, then you could foreclose, and the sheriff would take possession of the farm and auction it off and cause the family to leave, ask them to leave, and in a few cases force them to leave.
Do you remember how it made your dad feel? Do you
Oh,
remember?
very, very bad. As I say, all these people were friends and acquaintances of his, both the depositor who wanted his money, and I can remember the morning coming down when everybody slept upstairs in those days. I could remember coming downstairs and see his head between his knees, thinking, what's going to happen today?
Could you just, that was a great answer, but you said he, and because my voice is going to get cut out, we won't.
Sure.
Oh, okay, we're going to have to switch. That's your. If you could say.
End of the sound roll.
Mark?
Okay, so you can talk about your dad.
Well, my father was chosen as president of the bank probably by default, because at the time this trouble was appearing, no one wanted the job, because obviously there was going to be names called and offenses given and offenses made, and so he was chosen president and agreed to serve. And he was confronted within a few months thereafter by depositors who wanted their money. They had signed these waivers, which you haven't gotten into yet, I realize, but people wanted their money, and they were trying to delay the withdrawal of deposits. There was an instance early on of depositing gold coin on the table in front of the bank where everybody could see it, evidence of security. But there was more concern on the part of my father with lenders who had borrowed money and realized they couldn't pay. And these were by and large honest people of integrity who wanted to pay but couldn't. Hey, John H., that was his name, John, what am I going to do? I can't pay this loan that's coming due in 3 months. What am I going to do? Well, what do you do? And as I say, I remember coming down in the morning and seeing his head between his knees, wondering what was going to happen that day. And depositors, especially who were friends of his, wanted their money. They did exempt churches, charities, and I believe lodges, they could withdraw their money, but people who signed these waivers couldn't.
When the bank holiday, can you maybe just tell me the story then of this kind of local bank holiday? Just what exactly, just let that car go by.
Can you pull his
Oh, Ty?
his glass case out of his pocket?
Oh, okay,
What does he want?
that's fine. Is that better?
Okay, thank you.
So what was
Well-
this kind of solution that was attempted in
Well,
1932?
As this trauma was developing, there's obviously it needed some kind of solutions. And a mayor, I believe, of either Champaign or Urbana, Illinois, came up with this idea of a waiver where you waived the right to withdraw your funds from the bank. And that was brought before this group of bankers who, as I recall, it must have been July of 1933, had an all-night meeting, and they decided on that method if the mayor would approve. It took a mayor's proclamation. The city of Boone declared what's called a bank holiday. Not a holiday in the sense of a vacation. It meant it was time off from the normal activities where you couldn't withdraw your money. But the amount you owed the bank, of course, was due. But they attempted to stop this procedure of disorderly withdrawals by declaring a bank holiday.
And did it work?
About 95% of the people voluntarily signed a waiver to not withdraw their funds. What happened to the other 5% I've never been able to realize. I think a court order came along saying they were also bound by the decision of the 95. And yes, it worked. Until about a year later, there was Iowa legislation passed after FDR became president called Senate File 111, which mandated that Iowa banks go into receivership. And that stopped that waiver thing, and they reorganized and attempted a more orderly collection of their assets.
I was wondering if you could tell me something about the way agricultural prices fell. Do you remember? I mean, do you have some examples of the kinds of changes there were in prices?
After World War I, during World War I, there's a tremendous escalation in agricultural prices, the same as there has been in WW2. And when the war was over and demand had slackened from our allies and from ourselves to keep the army, a huge army, afloat, prices fell where corn was worth about 23 cents a bushel, hogs about $3.40 a hundred, cattle I think $1 more, about $4.40, $4.50 a hundred, which was disastrous. Real estate taxes, of course, stayed at their inordinately high level like they are now. I mean, the counties didn't suffer. Although there was some land taken over by counties for non-payment of taxes too, but there was a tremendous drop in asset value.
So when the farm prices fell, can you kind of describe all the businesses in the area that would be affected as farmers couldn't pay back? And
certainly it was a domino effect. If you owed money that you couldn't pay the bank, not only could you not pay the bank, you couldn't buy your kids shoes, you couldn't buy clothing, you couldn't pay what the modest amount of tuition was in those days to send your kids to school, the book fees, and the merchants went on credit. The grocery stores at that time were still selling groceries on credit instead of cash like they are now. So that meant that they were piling up tremendous amounts, and their people with whom they did business, their wholesalers, were unable to collect their money, so it was just domino is the only word to use.
you told Robin something. I wonder if you could repeat it for me. You said that corn got so cheap that people were actually just burning it?
Corn was so cheap that it was burned by some farmers for fuel in the wintertime, shoveled it into the furnace. Corn was a very hot item as far as it creates a lot of heat, does a lot of damage to the stove, but they need to keep warm.
Did you ever actually witness, or did your father have any experience with these penny auctions where when a farm had been foreclosed, the people would actually, and I guess it was going to be auctioned off?
There was none of that done here. Up in northwest Iowa, O'Brien County, for instance, there was that where farmers would get together, buy the farm at the sheriff's sale, and give it back to the fellow that same afternoon. That's the same area that resulted in the attempted lynching of a judge up there who allowed that sort of a thing to go on, or fostered it, but that did not succeed. I mean, I don't think he was finally killed. I don't know. But yes, there was some of those penny auctions, but not here in Boone.
So was that well, I was wondering how the atmosphere of that going on would have affected your father. If he
Emotionally, it was a terrible thing. Like I say, he had friends on all three sides of the coin. He had his fellow depositors in the bank. He was a depositor too. His funds were also frozen. He had to go along with, set an example. There were the stockholders of the bank, and when the bank finally did go under, some of those stockholders, since it was a state bank, they were not only lost their stock, but they were subject to 100% stock assessment. Mm-hmm. And there were attempts made in order to not pay that assessment to transfer assets into your wife's name or members of your family. And of course, he knew that was going on, and it was in contravention of the law as well as the spirit, and that made it hard to face those people. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, the borrowers couldn't pay, and they were, as I say, honest people by a large degree, so that affected them. They come to him, John, what can we do? Well, what can you do? You can't pay, your note's due, you borrowed it. You said you'd repay. I promised to pay, the note says, but they couldn't.
Do you recall a lot of banks, not your dad's banks, but a lot of banks failing around?
Oh my, yes, the state of Iowa. I think how many banks were there? I can't tell you, 500 maybe, that were in the same circumstance. Mm-hmm. They not only had money out to borrowers, but they had bought bonds of various institutions, city bonds back east of industrial bonds, and they declined in value too. This was not just an agricultural depression here. It was U.S. wide, and those bonds that had been worth 100 cents on the dollar dropped to 85, 60, 70. And he would say many times, if we could only hang on to those bonds, they'll pay out. Well, they did, but they didn't pay out soon enough for the bank to pay their depositors.
Okay, I need to cut for a second and review my question.
Mark?
Tell me about the corn.
Yes, well, corn would got to be a very cheap commodity. When I said 23 or 27 cents a bushel, I don't remember what I said. That was a nominal value. You oftentimes couldn't find a market for it. You couldn't find somebody to give you 23 or 27 cents a bushel. So a farmer, rather than incur the expense of hauling it to town, would burn it in his coal-fired stove to keep he and his kids warm during the winter. And it's a very hot burning commodity, so that was burned. After all, they kept alive that way, and it wasn't worth the trouble to bring it to Boone.
So people literally got to the point where they couldn't sell things for what it cost
Yes.
to make them.
Yes.
Can you describe sort of what your dad was seeing the farmers in the area confronting? Is that a way that you could describe the problem?
Well,
the farmers had?
I should say he owned some land also, a small amount of land, so he realized from the farmer that was on there, from a personal angle, not only the lenders not only the borrowers were coming into the bank, but these people who were on his own piece of land, that they were having trouble making a living, keeping things going. So it was a very traumatic thing. He'd go out and visit the farm. These farms were customarily rented on a 50-50 crop share basis, so 50% of the crop was his. And he was also suffering when he couldn't sell his corn for 23, 25 cents a bushel.
Mm-hmm. Do you recall whether the farms and the banks in the area were getting help from the Hoover administration? I know that the Hoover administration came in with a pledge to kind of help agriculture. They set up the Federal Farm Board
Yes.
in 1929. What do you recall if that was helping the people in this area?
Well, out here there was not the awareness of that help being forthcoming. There was
Could you kind of repeat my question of the either sense of Hoover's policies helping them?
You're asking whether Hoover's policies, which he attempted to start at the end of his office, helped the banks, and no, they did not. And there was a tremendous change, of course, when FDR came in, and his socialism experiments, that was looked with a great deal of disdain by everyone at that time. Of course.
So do you recall the Reconstruction Finance Corporation?
The RFC was formed. The modern parallel to that is called the Resolution Trust Corporation. They have that in existence now, which was used to bail out the savings and loans. But the RFC was an attempt to bail out the banks, but that was not much help around here. The magnitude was too great.
What did people around Boone think about President Hoover? Do you have a sense of how he was regarded as his administration?
The same thing as the President Bush's foes are today. The man in office is blamed for all the misdeeds of the past when they didn't realize some of that was their own fault. So Hoover was, I feel, mistakenly accused of causing some of this Great Depression.
Do you remember?
Sorry, Jerry, ran out on that question.
So you didn't have that? Okay, so we should do that.
Changing to camera roll 312-22, Goeppinger, take 4.
Refer to today. Okay, so what did you feel about Hoover?
Well, President Hoover was at the tail end of this.
I didn't hear it, I'm sorry.
Oh, you need to clap it? Do you need to clap?
Yeah.
Okay, here we go.
Sorry. 4.
Well, President Hoover was at the tail end of his administration when these problems were beginning to be exemplified and extended, and he was blamed for things that were happening which were not his fault. At least I don't feel, reading history, as they were his fault. And of course, that didn't alleviate the problem, and the fact that he was not at fault. These things were still happening. And a lot of people felt he was forced out of office because it was his fault.
Do you recall any sort of particular expressions or sayings about President Hoover that were popular in the area at the time, things that sort of exemplify what people felt?
No, I don't, except that he was, I remember he was referred to as an engineer, which he was, and was not acquainted with the problems that were existent at the time. They forgot the fact that he did a tremendous humanitarian job in Russia, but these things were happening and they were his fault. He should have known better. I remember that expression being mentioned.
Okay. Now, I'm going back to something we've talked about before, but I was
Sure.
hoping you could kind of paint this larger picture of how, when the agricultural prices started dropping, the whole system kind of fell down.
Well, yes, when agricultural prices fell, the farmer couldn't pay for his groceries, he couldn't pay for his shoes, he couldn't pay his banker, but there was another problem also. Boone was an important division point on the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. Had a large railroad payroll here, which were, for those times, as now, very high-paying jobs. And they were not hauling the commodities as a result of the agricultural depression. As a result, their payroll dropped. They reduced their payroll as fast as they could, not quite as fast as the farmers suffered. It helped mitigate Boone's situation for a short time because the railroad payroll was here and was being paid, but that began to drop off about 6 months after the agricultural situation became severe. But it extended to the schools. I mean, the kids they could tell that their dad and mother weren't doing very well, and the school system, I believe, noticed that there was a drop in the interest on the part of students. Churches suffered in their contributions. Community efforts begin to drop also. Red Cross, community drives. There wasn't the United Fund in those days, but there were a host of individual things. Boone had a YMCA, which was railroad supported. I think half the budget of the Y was supported by the railroad. It was a place for crews to stay overnight. They began to suffer, so it was just a general telegraphing.
What was it like, sort of emotionally, around the home of a banker? What were the feelings that you sensed?
There was a feeling on the part of my father, who was an officer of the bank, that
Excuse me.
what can I do?
Excuse me.
Oops,
Let's just wait for this.
it's a noisy truck. Just, if you can start
Yeah,
again.
I didn't realize
Okay.
that.
Okay.
Just start again, the feeling on.
When my father saw this trouble coming on, why he felt that he was the butt of the problem. Here he was in the middle. He was expected to find a solution to pay the depositors, to help the borrower redeem his loan, and he was unable to do that. And meeting these friends every day, he just hated to go to work some mornings. I know that. Yet he was looked on. I think he cut his salary by 50%, which was modest in those days anyhow. And he ran into another problem. As I say, many of these stockholders were forced to pay a stock assessment, and they wouldn't pay, and they transferred assets into their families' names, and he knew that, and he was trying to collect this money, and it was generally ineffective because of the transfers that had taken place.
Now, the farmers kind of did have one response kind of common around this area, which was this Farmers Holiday Association, this idea.
Yes,
Tell me something about that.
they tried to hold back their products.
Could you start again and say the farmers?
The farmer, in order to cause even a small increase in price, got together under various umbrella organizations. You must bear in mind that the farmer has never been able to organize. He's an independent minded. That is the case today, and farmers' organizations have been notorious for their ineffectiveness. But they did try to form groups that would dump milk, for instance. If they saw a farmer delivering milk to the dairy, they'd meet him someplace out in the country and dump the cans of milk. Small pigs were slaughtered and buried. I don't recall that happening to beef cattle, but it was done in the case of hogs and milk.
So what was the goal? Just if you can kind of.
What to take, pardon me, the goal was to remove these products from the marketplace. The less goods you have to sell, maybe the price will go up, because there's always some demand for agricultural products. Agricultural demand is also inelastic. That is, after you've had a meal, for 5 cents, I can't sell you another meal. So you can only eat so much corn and so much pork chops in a day. And that's what they were faced with that too. And the industrial community back east didn't have the money then too, so they couldn't buy the agricultural products.
Do you think that this kind of unusual coming together of the farmers was partly was the result of this depression conditions?
Oh, yes. There's no doubt about that. But it soon, it did not last because the farmer, after all, if a farmer needed money to raise his kids, he wasn't going to dump his milk. That's all he had to sell. It's like shooting your wife. You can't do that if she's providing a home for you.
Do you recall anything in particular about the 1932 elections out of the way? I mean, what was the feeling around Boone, those elections between Hoover and FDR?
Yes, there was a feeling that, hey, something needs to be done. Hoover was ineffective. It was his fault, reading into the minds of the people of the electorate. But here comes FDR, who has made certain promises, and there was a dissatisfaction on the part of the financial community with his methods of obtaining relief. But that same method that he used for relief was very acceptable to the people who were going to be the beneficiaries.
So, I was just wondering if you could one more time tell
Sure.
me about your feelings about the way Hoover was unfairly blamed for
Wait
the
a second for this truck. Sorry. Okay, thank you.
Well, there was a feeling that Hoover should have been blamed for it. They did not realize, looking back in retrospect, that the world, even in those days, was one large homogeneous unit, and we did depend on each other, not as much then as we do now. But there were forces that were brought to bear on Hoover that he could not have stopped, and but that's not the way the people felt, and they felt he should be blamed. After all, when you're real hungry and your kids don't have shoes, somebody's got to be blamed, or you do blame somebody, and he was the one.
Where would you have placed the blame for, or what many places might you have placed the blame for the way that things collapsed toward the end of the decade?
I would not have placed the blame on the administration. Of course, I'm looking back in retrospect, having seen successive administrations come and go. It was probably greed on the part of everyone who wanted a higher standard of living. The standard of living was just then being increased tremendously. Automobiles were coming into general use, telephones, radios. Hey, why can't I have more of that? And so greed was a factor. And a lot of it was inescapable.
Okay, great. Can we cut for a second? Did survive, or the ways in which...
Goeppinger, take 5.
Well, there was some lifting yourself by your bootstraps. Hey, I will help my neighbor. You know, if a farmer did have something that his neighbor needed, there was a tremendous individual effort, but there
were
were
there efforts-
nothing community-wide.
I was wondering if there were efforts, from the bank, if your dad's work to, try to help people, give them an extension of time, or try to help them get through. I just don't
Well,
know.
They couldn't give them an extension of time because they just weren't paying. I mean, so
This was the money.
the borrower extended his time by not paying, and the bank was holding off, thinking, well, maybe tomorrow, mañana,
Well, that's
Okay.
that's kind of it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Do you feel like things not yours
Mhm.
done concisely enough for you?
Do we have enough roll?
We have 3 minutes.
No. Just
Sort of the
Specifically-
procedure that how one leads up.
We're going to do Goeppinger, take 5 now.
Well, not the legal procedure, but you were talking about what happens if people fall behind and they go to the bank or say, well, I can't pay, and then you have to go out to the farm and you have to get the sheriff, and something of the procedure of how.
I think the legal
Yeah.
details are less.
I don't think people care for the legal
than-
details. I don't
but
know.
I think what's
It was
really
done.
is that it was. Then we can use up.
Sure,
This
sure.
Okay, now we're going to do Goeppinger, take 5. Previous was wild track.
Yes,
So we need
Steve?
the.
Are you going to
slide.
roll?
5 more.
So
Well, as the bank had trouble collecting these loans, the only alternative was for foreclosure. That was the legal remedy. So the bank would go to the courts and get a foreclosure order, and the sheriff was the implementer of that, and he would foreclose on the farmer and take possession of the farm. The farm would then be the property of the bank. In some cases, the bank let the people stay on the farm to farm it, but they immediately lost the income from half of it because the bank retained 50% of the income.
And what was the emotional toll on your dad?
The emotional toll was terrible because here were people who he knew. Hey, we're losing our family farm. My grandfather farmed this place. Some cases, my father farmed it, and here I'm losing it. They'd come to him, John, what can we do? Well, there's nothing I can do. My hands are tied. The law says I must do this to protect my depositors. I've got people coming to me tomorrow morning that want to write a check on the bank to pay the shoe man, pay the grocery store, and I have to honor those checks. Well, do it with somebody else's money, but not mine. So there was a tremendous interplay between their favoritism shown. The depositors thought that some depositors were being paid off and they weren't, and how come he got his money and I'm not? And that was never the case.
Was that a characteristic of a bank in a small town? I mean, this sort of sense of...
Well, yes. If you and I are suffering, and if I happen to
Can
get,
you wait just a second? Sorry.
you'll come to Boone never again.
Okay.
As people wanted their money, and they had to have it, and they couldn't understand why somebody may have gotten their money and they didn't. That was never the case outside of churches and charities. They were allowed an exemption of where they could withdraw their money. Why, I don't know.
So what was your dad facing, friends and...
Facing friends of depositors and borrowers who wanted to pay, and depositors who wanted their money. And there was a great gulf between them. The bank only had so much capital, and when that was gone, why, that was the end of it. And it was a terrible trauma.
Great.
He's going to touch
Great.
it.
That was great.
That was very good. It's sort of the sound of the room, which will... include
Next
the
is
sounds of
room
traffic.
tone for the Goeppinger interview.
Sure.
So we just need to sit silently.
Okay, and recording?